Morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of We Got This Washington webinar series. My name is Markham McIntyre. I'm the Executive Vice President and Acting Head of the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. I want to start by thanking our promotional partner, the Business Health Trust, for sponsoring this series, as well as our wonderful friends over at the Bellevue Chamber and the Tacoma Pierce County Chamber for helping promote this edition. A few logistical notes before we get started. First, if you have any technological issues, please use the chat function and message Lee, who can try and help you out. Second, if you have questions for either myself or Congressman Kilmer, please use the Q&A box, which you can see here highlighted on the screen. And then finally, just to note that this will be recorded, and then we will have a link to this that we'll share out with our members and partners after this. With that, let's jump in. I do want to make a couple comments about current events. We've certainly been sending some messages to our members about what's going on, but just wanted to start out the program with a couple notes. Our mission here at the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce is to help our members thrive in an inclusive and equitable regional economy. But we cannot have an inclusive and equitable regional economy if we continue to have hate, violence, and discrimination. Our business community here, which is as thoughtful, kind, generous, and forward-thinking as any in the country, has a tremendous platform on which to try and build systemic change, and we need to do that right now. Since the start of this pandemic, we've been thinking a lot about what economic recovery for this region looks like. And we believe we have an opportunity right now to build a more equitable, more resilient, and more economically competitive economy. However, I think we also recognize that words are not enough. And I want to be clear that the Chamber is going to be working closely with our partners and our members as we work to build a more anti-racist and inclusive economy going forward. We know that this work is going to be hard, and oftentimes it's going to be very uncomfortable, but we're all going to be better off for it. And I pledge to you that we're going to do our best to be an active partner in that work. And with that, I know that we've also got a great partner in this work in Representative Derek Kilmer, our speaker on today's webinar. Representative Kilmer was born and raised in Port Angeles, and he now represents Washington's 6th Congressional District. As we think about economic recovery, we are really lucky to have Representative Kilmer working for this Washington in the other Washington. He has a strong background in economic development. He's skilled at working across the aisle in a bipartisan fashion. He's the chair of the New Dem Coalition, and he has his finger on the pulse of Main Street businesses throughout his district and across the state. With that, I'll turn it over to Representative Kilmer to hear some remarks, and then we'll dive into a Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Markham, and good morning, everybody. Let me just start by saying thanks to the Chamber for having me today. Obviously, it's a really challenging time, and I know even prior to the events of the last week, folks have been looking for resources and support, and frankly, our chambers of commerce and our other economic development partners have been stepping up in such a big way to ensure that local employers are resilient and hopefully emerge from this pandemic stronger than ever. So thank you, first and foremost, for what you're doing. Before I dive into some of the federal response to coronavirus and the efforts around reopening, I do want to just take a few moments to acknowledge some of the events of the last week and talk through some of what I've been thinking about lately. There is understandably and justifiably a lot of pain and anger in communities across our region and our state and our nation, you know, on top of a public health crisis that has led to the death of over 100,000 Americans and which has disproportionately affected communities of color. Last week, we saw a Black American murdered in Minneapolis by a uniformed police officer, and it was horrific, and it was heartbreaking, and it was wrong. And you know, George Floyd's murder was a violation of the social contract that we agree to uphold as members of this society. And part of that contract is the trust that those hired to keep us safe will do just that. And his murder shouldn't have happened in this country. And the murder of George Floyd, though, has not been the only murder of a Black American for which there has not yet been justice. Indeed, too many innocent Black Americans are being killed in communities around our country, and their families deserve justice and accountability. And I want to say up front, I'm grateful that the Chamber issued a statement acknowledging that George Floyd's life matters, as do the lives of other Black Americans. I also know that many of the Chamber members have been affected by the activities of the last week, and that's on top of the negative impact of coronavirus. And I know many of the Chamber members, like the Chamber itself did, have issued really important statements of community and solidarity and action. And I want to say thank you for that as well. The Apostle Paul said, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And that's the task at hand. There's a lot of steps of that. Listening and learning and standing in solidarity and taking action need to be part of that. And there's clearly a need to reform police practices to ensure that there's just treatment and accountability no matter where you live in this country. But we know that beyond policing, there are other systemic injustices that have been built into other aspects of life in our country that disadvantage Black Americans. And there are inequities in housing and education and healthcare and criminal justice, just to name a few, that also require our attention and our action. I've been spending a lot of time over the last few days really just trying to do a lot of listening, listening to African American leaders and constituents within my district. Yesterday, I chaired the New Democrat Coalition, and we had 3/4 of our members on a call with the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, and we just listened to not just Chairwoman Bass, but to our colleagues within the Congressional Black Caucus to just listen and learn from their lived experience. And I think that's part of what needs to happen in the coming days, is to listen and learn and to stand in solidarity, and importantly, to take action to address some of these inequities. So I mentioned that up front, and I also want to just offer to be a thought partner and a partner in action to the Chamber. So thank you for that. Obviously, the tragedy related to the murder of George Floyd and the unrest in our country comes on the heels of the largest public health crisis of all of our lifetimes and the most significant economic disruption since the Great Depression. Here in Washington State, we've seen over 21,000 confirmed cases of the coronavirus. Nearly 1,130 people have died from it. I'm conscious of the fact that each one of those is not just a number and a statistic, but is somebody's mom or dad, or husband or wife, or son or daughter. We've seen over 1.1 million Washingtonians file for unemployment benefits in the 9 weeks since the economy was put into a medically induced coma. And perhaps the most common question I get is, how do we get back to normal? And it's what I've been asked in nearly every town hall and every media interview I've had since the coronavirus began. All of us want to be able to go back out in public without worrying about getting sick, or worrying about our customers or our coworkers. We all want to see our economy awakened from this period, so we can support ourselves and we can support our families. And we all want to get back to working and shopping and worshiping and living our lives in a manner that resembled what happened before any of us had heard of COVID-19. And I guess in the time I have, I want to just, and my goal is not to talk at you for a whole long time, but rather to hopefully have a dialogue with you. I wanted to just highlight a few things that I think are going to be really important in that pathway to recovery. And first, and something that we've been working as a congressional delegation on quite a bit, is testing. The reality is that we know that the virus really is going to dictate some of the terms of our reopening and our public health response, including part of that is the ability to test for this virus and trace it. That's going to be a big factor in how we all proceed until there is a safe vaccine. And so to that end, I think it's disappointing that we have really lacked a federally coordinated national testing strategy to significantly increase testing capabilities in our country. I think people forget the time frame sometimes, but almost 4 months ago, it was on February the 4th, that I led a bipartisan and bicameral letter with Senator Murray and nearly 50 members of Congress to call on the CDC for more testing capacity to be produced and to be delivered. And yet here we are today in June, and we still aren't where we need to be as a state or as a nation with regard to testing capacity. And the blueprints are there for what we need, but the right levers have not been pulled. In fact, it was mentioned I lead the New Democrat Coalition in Congress. Over a month and a half ago, we laid out a three-pronged approach for widespread containment and mitigation to ensure that communities have the ability, first and foremost, to rapidly test every symptomatic case of those suspected to be exposed, to do that work of serological testing to understand how and whether we've developed any semblance of immunity or who has. And three, to trace all contacts of known cases, because without getting our testing right, we aren't going to be able to open the economy in the manner that we all want. In addition to that, I still believe that our federal government needs to do a better job of protecting frontline workers. I've heard the president say that we're at war against an invisible enemy, but we would never send our soldiers to war without the equipment they need to be safe. And in this war, part of that is access to personal protective equipment and access to testing. And it's why I've called on the president to leverage the Defense Production Act to pivot American manufacturing might to produce some of the medical gear and equipment that we need to beat this virus and to keep people safe. And I for the life of me, I don't understand the reticence of President Trump and his administration to more aggressively pull that lever. So that's going to be part of it. The House included in the most recent coronavirus relief package a direction to both leverage the Defense Production Act more fully and to have a national strategy for testing. And I think that's going to be really important. Second thing, as we think about the economic recovery, is to recognize that our states and local governments that are on the front lines of this are going to need some help. A few weeks ago, Governor Inslee announced that the state is expecting a $6.6 billion shortfall over the next 3 years due to the COVID-related economic downturn. And acknowledging that I'm speaking to a Chamber of Commerce, I just want to lay out some of the equities of that and some of the risks involved if you don't see additional federal support. Probably most importantly is 70% of the state's budget is protected by law, and the remaining 30%, in the absence of additional federal support, will just get hammered. And unfortunately, if past is prologue, perhaps the area of most significant threat is to higher education. And if you look at past recessions in our state, higher ed gets treated like the rainy day fund because it's not constitutionally protected. And if that happens, it will further threaten the ability to grow and find talent in the state of Washington. And so I think it is really important that the federal government step up and support states like Washington during this time. The HEROES Act that recently passed in the House would do that. You know, frankly, the other thing that might happen in the absence of additional federal support is either a very, very significant cutbacks, not just to higher ed, but to other important services provided by state and local government, other significant layoffs. And we heard from the chairman of the Fed that if that were to happen, we run the risk of a longer term recession, a greater hit to our national debt, and potentially even going into the territory of a depression. And you've heard that from other economists as well. What's more, there's the threat that, again, in the absence of federal support, the state can't run a deficit, and the federal government can, and I'm happy to talk some about what I think we can do on that front. But I'm concerned about that, and I think every one of us ought to be looking for the federal government to step up, not just to deal, as the CARES Act did, with the costs associated with this virus, but also addressing some of the lost revenue. Third, when we talk about lost revenue, I think the federal response also needs to be more mindful of the impact to employers and to their employees. I'm a strong believer in the saying that many of you heard from me before, and that's this: the best way we can keep unemployment numbers down is to keep people employed. I look at our small businesses as not only the backbone of our economy, they're our economy's star running back. If you look at how we make it out of recessions, it's generally actually not the biggest employers that are growing the jobs. It's our star running back, our small businesses that are racking up the tough yards and scoring the touchdowns on main streets, in towns and cities all across our country. They're responsible for creating over 60% of new jobs in the private sector. Unfortunately, right now, our star running back is being tackled behind the line of scrimmage. And I think part of the job of the federal government is to call some plays and to do some blocking for our star running back. And that's why I work to ensure that in the CARES Act, there was included both an expansion of economic injury disaster loans and the Paycheck Protection Program to help keep their workers on the payroll. Honestly, I think there's far more that needs to be done. You saw the House pass late last week. I was in Washington, D.C., and we passed legislation to expand the Paycheck Protection Program and to add some flexibility to it, to move beyond just 8 weeks of payroll protection out of an acknowledgement that the impacts of this are just going to last longer, and extending that to 24 weeks. Importantly, in the HEROES Act, there was also the expansion of something. I want to flag this for the Chamber and for its members, because I think when we see a bipartisan agreement on the next coronavirus package, my sense is it will include a significantly expanded employee retention tax credit that is available to employers that have been economically hurt by the coronavirus. And it's essentially an encouragement for businesses of all sizes to hold on to their employees, so workers can continue to receive income and employer-sponsored benefits without having to seek unemployment. And while that was included in the CARES Act, frankly, it was not robust enough to do the job. And in the HEROES Act that passed out of the House, you see a much more expansive approach to make sure that employers can keep employees on the payroll. So I just wanted to flag that for you. Fourth, one of the things that I have acknowledged as we deal with this virus is, I keep having running through my head the scene from Jaws where Brody goes into the cabin of the boat and says, "We're going to need a bigger boat." What we've seen in terms of the federal response has persistently been that the problem has outstripped the solution. We don't know how long the impacts of this will last. And so one of the things that I've been advocating for, and that the New Democrat Coalition has been advocating for, is just building some automatic stabilizers into the federal response that would trigger additional assistance as negative conditions persist or possibly worsen. I worked for McKinsey & Company in Seattle for several years. I then worked in Tacoma in economic development for about a decade. And my observation is what employers want from government, perhaps more than anything else, is just an environment of trust and predictability. That's really hard right now because these are very unpredictable times. But if we put automatic stabilizers into practice, that would enable programs to automatically deliver help where it is needed, when it is needed, without having to rely on Congress to keep passing bills that only estimate what will be needed, and with the brinkmanship that you consistently see out of our nation's capital. So I think without that, you're going to see vital programs that are intended to get help to families and small businesses that have been rocked by this pandemic either run out of assistance too early or held up by political brinkmanship. And so that's something that I've been calling for, both with regard to some of the programs through the Small Business Administration, even things like unemployment assistance, where, after the crisis of 2008, you saw Congress vote 13 separate times for federal support for unemployment assistance. I think that doesn't make a whole lot of sense when we could just set some parameters on the front end of when federal support should be provided, and perhaps as importantly, when it should be shut off. Final thing I want to talk about is, what the federal government has done so far has not been stimulus. What I've heard in the media, when I hear the press refer to the most recent stimulus bill, I confess I bristle a little bit, because that's not really what you've seen. What you've seen out of the federal government has been actions focused on trying to stop the bleeding. at some point, we actually do need to talk about what economic stimulus looks like. And there's a whole lot of things I could talk about in this regard. Let me just focus on a couple. One, I think, is investments in worker training. The reality of today is that right now there are 39 million Americans that have filed for unemployment in our country since this pandemic began, which is something we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And it's a real possibility that many of those jobs that folks had before simply will not come back. So I think as we think about the future, we should also be thinking about how the federal government can empower American workers to navigate that substantial economic change rather than to be victimized by it. And one of the things that I've called for, and I'm a sponsor of a new bill, it's bipartisan, called the Skills Renewal Act, would be to provide a flexible skills training credit to folks so that they can pursue an apprenticeship or take college classes or get enrolled in retraining programs so that they can learn new skills, land new jobs, and earn a good living. We heard from the chairman of the Fed that there was a real risk at the erosion of skills given the prolonged nature of this crisis. So that's part of the rationale behind it. It is bipartisan bill. It's bipartisan in the Senate as well. And it's these kinds of programs and ideas that I think are going to be critical to helping folks who've lost their jobs through no fault of their own to hopefully be able to navigate this. I would also mention, I think it's important that Congress finally act on the issue of infrastructure. You know, over the years, infrastructure has been sort of a talking point, but not an action item in Congress. And I think this is an area where you could actually see Democrats and Republicans come together, because we haven't seen Democratic roads or Republican bridges or, you know, Democratic water systems. You know, we know we have transit systems that are in need of repair. We know we have a power grid waiting to enter the 21st century. I think there are parts of the state where the speed limit signs are only there for nostalgic purposes. I am cognizant of that usually prior to this pandemic when I entered Seattle via I-5. So I think it's important that we take a really serious look at finally coming together around a comprehensive infrastructure bill. It is expected that Congress, at least on the House side, will pass a surface transportation bill in the month of June or perhaps early July. I think that's important, and I think that can be vital to putting people to work now and hopefully laying the foundation for economic growth over the long haul. I want to say one other thing, and then I'll open it up to questions. I may have already yammered on longer than you wanted me to. I also think when we talk about infrastructure, that needs to include broadband. I represent a district that is unfortunately in the bottom 20% of the country when it comes to access to the internet. And I think what we know and what we've seen through this pandemic is that access to the internet is not just about whether folks can watch Tiger King on Netflix, which, by the way, is totally bonkers. But it's, you know, can your kid keep learning if school got canceled? Or can you apply for unemployment insurance if you lost your job? Or can you keep operating your business if your storefront had to shut down? And for a whole lot of the people I represent, the answer to that is no. And, you know, I'd been working on issues around bridging the digital divide before this pandemic, but I think it's really, really important that that happens in the face of this pandemic. So I know that's a lot, but to me, I think that maybe getting back to normal means folding some of the lessons learned from this pandemic into a new normal that works better for all of you as members of the chamber, and hopefully for your teams and for your workers as well. So let me stop there.
Great, thank you. That was a great comprehensive kind of look at what's happening, particularly with the HEROES Act. Could you start by giving us kind of a sense of timing about when a bipartisan package might be passed and some of the politics between now and when that would happen?
Yeah, a bipartisan package in response to coronavirus, or
Sure. Well, you mentioned kind of the next bipartisan.
sure.
And I guess you split that into two things. So there's kind of, is there more relief coming, and then also when a stimulus package might happen beyond that?
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification. So a few things. One, the House already passed the HEROES Act. I think to some degree it was an effort to use the laws of physics. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. And so the movement on the HEROES Act, I think, was an effort to put the object into motion, to acknowledge, despite, and I don't say this in a partisan way, you know, you heard the Senate Majority Leader say, I don't think we need to do a fifth response bill. Let's just wait and see. And the concern with that is, you know, listen, I got 40 school teachers in Aberdeen who got pink slips because the school district doesn't have the money to keep them on the payroll. And you know, those pink slips didn't wait, and they're not going to wait for Mitch McConnell to identify that we need a fifth bill. You know, you've seen the city of Tacoma, for example, furlough, I think now over 250 of their staff. You know, part of the reason this bill is called the HEROES Act is, you know, we've seen nurses that have lost their jobs. We've seen teachers that have lost their jobs. We've seen firefighters and first responders who've lost their jobs. You know, these are the folks we've been leaning on in the face of this pandemic. And, you know, I think part of the response from the federal government ought to be that you're not, you know, we're going to have your back. And you've started to see, now that the House has passed the HEROES Act a couple weeks ago, you're starting to see it actually put the object into motion. And there started to be some discussion from the Senate that, yes, indeed, we need to have a fifth legislative package. My sense is that that's probably not a this week thing or a next week thing, but probably looking at July. That's largely speculation on my part, but I can't imagine the Senate going into recess for the month of August without taking action on a fifth response bill. In terms of stimulus, it just depends on how broad, how big and how broad the response is. A narrowly focused surface transportation bill and Water Resources Development Act without a lot of money attached to it could move very quickly. But I think if we're going to get serious about trying to drive some economic activity and put people to work, that probably comes with a bigger price tag, and as a consequence, may take a little while to land the plane.
And then you mentioned how small businesses really are the lifeblood of our economy, both here in Washington State, but across the country. What are some things that the Chamber and other business associations could be advocating for, some specific things that you think would really help provide relief to those small businesses and then also set them on the path to recovery?
I wouldn't sleep on the employee retention tax credit or some other approach. You know, there's a lot of ideas that have floated around just trying to have a means of keeping workers connected to their jobs. My colleague, Representative Jayapal, has the Paycheck Guarantee Act. The employee retention tax credit is sponsored by Susan Del Bene and by myself and some others. You know, all of these are really geared towards the same problem statement, and that is how do we keep people connected to their jobs, acknowledging that the impacts of this may just go on for a little while longer. In terms of you know, I give a lot of credit to the Chamber, not just to your Chamber, but to chambers all around the state that are really trying to provide a service to employers to make sure that they're aware of the resources that are available. We're continuing to look at putting tools into that toolbox, including some of the changes that were proposed last week to the Paycheck Protection Program. And if we get that across the finish line, we'll be leaning on the Chamber and its members to sort of evangelize those changes so that the employers on main streets all over our country can take advantage of it.
Yeah, and thanks again for supporting those changes. We've heard both members who have thought that the Paycheck Protection Program is fantastic and others who've said very clearly that it's not working the way that it was described or intended to. And one of the roadblocks seems to be, even when there are resources out there, some of the barriers for businesses to access them. Can you talk a little bit about how the federal government could help provide more technical assistance to businesses who are interested in getting some of those resources or figuring out how they might access those resources?
Yeah, and you know, I'll say up front, part of the reason you've seen a shift in focus to whether it's the paycheck guarantee or the employer retention tax credit is, this has been largely overwhelming for an agency like the SBA that over the course of a month gave out more loans than it had in the previous several years. And so, and that's not to diss on the SBA. I think, our region has stepped up and really, tried to provide good service to folks. That has been somewhat overwhelming, though. I will say that the CARES Act included funding for some really important entities that don't get a lot of attention: the Minority Business Development Agency, the Veterans Business Outreach Centers, and the Small Business Development Centers. All received additional funding in the CARES Act, and all, I think, provide really valuable resources to employers on the ground. Now, not every employer knows to connect with their local small business development center, and so we've certainly tried to be a connector to people who need services, to those who provide those services. And I know the Chamber has as well, and I really appreciate that.
You brought up infrastructure, which is a hot topic every year with Chamber members, and not just transportation infrastructure. I was pleased that you're talking about some other types of infrastructure. One that we're hearing more and more about is childcare. And just, can you describe what you think the federal government's role in helping figure out childcare support, particularly for people who need childcare to go back to work? We're hearing both from the employers as well as employees that until there's clarity on, there's the educational system, but also the other pieces of childcare support that are out there. Can you talk a little bit about the federal role in helping make sure those are working so that we can get people back to work as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think this is a really big deal. As we've had a discussion around, sort of what comes next, making sure that there's adequate access to childcare services, I think is going to be really important. Particularly as we look at, not just the summer months where families are always wondering, okay, what do I do with my kids? But also in the face of, a lot of questions around what happens this fall with schools. Part of the way you've seen the federal response has just been to plus up funding for the child care services block grant program. Senator Murray is actually working on some new legislation related to the expansion of child care services. I think that's going to be really important. We're also looking at some new options, trying to figure out, are there avenues to co-locate, as we talk about infrastructure. I appreciated how you engaged that question, because, one of the things we've talked about is there a way to provide some federal support for co-location of services? So you could co-locate, childcare with local transit. Is there, are those sort of options as we think about more broadly about infrastructure to integrate solutions related to childcare with other investments we're making? I know the Association of Washington Business late last year found that it's costing Washington businesses more than $2 billion per year in employee turnover or missed work, and the total cost to the state economy tops more than $6.5 billion per year. So this is something that I think is an issue all throughout the state of Washington, and I think will be an important piece of the next response.
We'd love to work with you and Senator Murray and whomever else from the delegation on that question, because it is really important both for our workers and our employers. There's a question here about how we can decarbonize our economy as we reinvent it. How can we limit the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that comes out of the ground and increase electrification of our utilities, transportation, and industry? As we exit this recession that has reduced the amount of fossil fuels used, can we use this as a springboard for decarbonizing the economy?
Yeah, I think that's important. Interestingly enough, I mentioned that we're going to see a surface transportation bill. I think actually it may be dropping today. And one of the things that the Democratic caucus has certainly discussed is ensuring that as we make investments in infrastructure, that part of that helps pivot our economy towards a cleaner and greener infrastructure. Looking at the use of renewable fuels, looking at things like charging stations for electronic vehicles. More broadly, I and several others in the Washington State delegation are sponsors of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act to put a price on carbon. And I think, as we work to transition this economy, that's going to be really important as well. I wish I could tell you I had confidence that not only the House, but also that the Senate and that this White House would take the importance of that pivot seriously. I don't think that's the case right now. Unfortunately, you've seen this White House move in the wrong direction with regard to addressing climate change, including dropping the auto emission standards that were set under President Obama. Importantly, in the surface transportation bill that, as I said, is likely to come up in June or July, it includes some provisions to put the United States on a path towards zero emissions from the transportation sector. The way it does that is by prioritizing carbon pollution reduction, by making more investment in public transit and the national rail network, by building out some of our fueling infrastructure for low and zero emission vehicles, and by deploying technology and innovation in some of the materials that are used in our transportation sector. So it's a great question. I know that this is a priority for me, and I know that it's a priority in the House. My hope is that I'm a big believer in what Lincoln said. Lincoln said public sentiment is everything, and I'm hopeful that we will see public sentiment push for changes, not just as I mentioned, but frankly, some of the areas where the state of Washington and the city of Seattle have really shown a lot of leadership in building more resilient infrastructure that can withstand the impacts of climate change, making our streets safer for all road users, including pedestrians and cyclists, understanding and valuing the importance of public transit. I think these are all areas that ought to be a focus within the surface transportation bill, and at least in the House will most assuredly be.
Thanks, and thanks for giving me some more detail about that surface transportation bill. Here's a question about nonprofit and cultural institutions like museums and theaters have been especially hard hit by the pandemic and will likely be some of the last institutions to reopen and recover. What ideas do you have to help these nonprofits, particularly those that self-insure for unemployment and suddenly have huge insurance liabilities?
Yeah, this is probably something we've heard more than perhaps anything else over the course of this. It's again part of what makes our economy in this state so vibrant is that we have some really amazing cultural institutions that unfortunately are really getting hammered right now. And some of this was addressed somewhat in the CARES Act, with nonprofits being eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. The changes that are being proposed out of the House, at least with regard to the Paycheck Protection Program, I think can and will be helpful in that regard. You also saw in the CARES Act, and then to some degree, not a ton of degree, in the HEROES Act, funding for some of the national institutions that support cultural institutions on the ground in communities all throughout this country. The National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for Humanities, and the Institute for Museum and Library Services all saw funding in the CARES Act. There was also, and this maybe gets at one of your earlier questions around what can members of the chamber do. You saw in the CARES Act an increase in the deductibility of charitable donations. That also is included in the HEROES Act, sort of lifting that deductibility. We have also raised with the Secretary of the Treasury looking at some of the lending institutions that were allowed to be established through the CARES Act to focus on some of the nonprofit cultural institutions, including some of the larger nonprofits that were kind of aced out in the CARES Act assistance. And they have said that that will be part of some of the ongoing support from the federal government. The only other thing that I'll mention on this front is the employee retention tax credit and some of the other tax provisions in the HEROES Act aren't unique to for-profit businesses. They also apply to nonprofits. And I think that can be really helpful going forward as well. Let me just say one other quick thing, and that is, I know that chambers like yours were unfortunately excluded from the assistance in the CARES Act. I'm a co-sponsor of a bill called the Local Chamber and Tourism Protection Act to expand that paycheck protection program to include 501c6 organizations such as local chambers of commerce like this one. That was folded into the HEROES Act. Like the businesses they serve, we know that a lot of local chambers are now experiencing their own financial challenges, and I think it's important to step up and make sure we have their backs.
I appreciate you doing that. Here's a question. From what we've heard from many experts, we won't return to pre-COVID economy for 2 to 3 years. How is Congress looking at handling this length of time if the economic destruction looks to continue for a while?
Well, it's part of the reason I mentioned the issue around automatic stabilizers, right? The problem is, in an environment where we just repeatedly play the scene from Jaws, where we recognize the need for a bigger boat, it means we're always going to be in reaction mode. And I actually think, with regard to the programs established through the Small Business Administration, with regard to support for the unemployment compensation system, with regard to some of the things that really help people who are vulnerable right now, like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that help people put food on the table, with regard to something that's wonky and maybe not on everybody's lips, something called FMAP, which is federal support for Medicaid at the state level to make sure that people are able to continue to get health care. All of these things are going to require further federal intervention. And you can either see Congress respond reactively each time a program expires or assistance expires, or Congress can acknowledge on the front end, okay, under what situations will Congress continue to provide this support? And let's just build those in as triggers on the front end, acknowledging that when those conditions improve, then the assistance goes away. I think that makes a lot of sense, not just with regard to assistance to local businesses, but to unemployed workers, and with regard to states that, in the absence of that continued federal intervention, are going to have to make very significant cuts.
A study done a number of years ago by our friends over at the Washington Council on International Trade showed that 40% of jobs in Washington state are somehow tied to international trade. As hard as this might be, what are you thinking about when you think about international trade? How does that recover? What can Washington state do to reposition itself to again be a big player in international trade? What does that look like from the federal perspective?
I just looked at the clock for the first time in this because I may take more than 11 minutes to answer that question. So I'll try to make my response shorter and cogent. So one of the strengths of our region's economy is that we're really good at making stuff that we send to other parts of the world, and that whether we're talking about airplanes, software, apples, cherries, delicious almond roca made in Washington's 6th Congressional District, wood products, or a whole bunch of other things, we benefit from trade. Having said that, it was also the canary in our coal mine. Before we had a single case diagnosed in the state of Washington, I actually started working on a coronavirus response bill, in part because I heard from constituents. We heard from a mill in Grays Harbor County that uses wood fiber, ships it to China, and it gets turned into, workout clothes. And 95% of their sales were to China. And they said they reached out before we had a single case diagnosed in the United States and said, all of the ports that we ship into have shut down in China. This is rocking our revenues. I represent a whole bunch of people in the 6th Congressional District whose livelihoods are tied to growing shellfish. And, there's not really much of a domestic market for gooey duck. They ship them to Asia, and they were seeing their markets shut down. And so we started working on coronavirus response largely because we were already hearing from employers, and actually went to work on broadening the definition of a disaster so that businesses could apply for the Small Business Administration's economic injury disaster loans. That actually started before we started working on that legislation before we had a case diagnosed, and that got put into the first coronavirus response bill. So as we look about how to respond to it, though, there's a few things we need to be thinking about. One is the sort of Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. I would argue that the continuation of this administration's policy of tariff escalation and continued trade war is particularly damaging in the state of Washington. I have talked to employers in my district and all over the state who were already on their heels because of that escalation of tariff war. Because our state is so trade dependent, that has been particularly damaging to us. And so we need to have a more thoughtful trade policy that isn't just around tariff escalation, but is focused on trying to set the rules of the road for trade in a way that reduces tariff and non-tariff barriers and sets smart standards that work for American workers, that work with regard to environmental protection and the protection of intellectual property. Frankly, this administration's been mostly AWOL in those conversations, and it may likely take a new administration to really reset our trade relationships in a way that's thoughtful and strategic and beneficial to trade-dependent states like ours. The other thing, obviously we have an amazing alliance. The partnership between the Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma, the Seaport Alliance, is really vital. When I mention the discussion around infrastructure, that includes the upcoming consideration of the Water Resources Development Act, which is part of the way that the federal government funds port-related infrastructure. Our state has generally been net donors to those investments, in part because we have natural deep water ports. And so looking at, within that Water Resources Development Act, providing additional assistance to donor ports so that the funds that get paid into these accounts that are intended for things like dredging can also be used flexibly by the Port of Seattle and by the Port of Tacoma. These are all things that we're working on and can be beneficial to our competitiveness when we think about global trade.
Thanks, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty more to come on that particular topic. We'll try and squeeze in a couple more questions here.
I kept it to 5 minutes rather than...
That's impressive. That was impressive. That was good. Okay, going back to broadband access, here's a question about, is Congress considering granting broadband deployment loans or grants in some way other than the reverse auction with no accountability? And then there's a comment about that seems to have been a spectacular failure the first time, and it could simply be repeated.
Yeah. So the short answer to that is yes. That is a consideration. Some of this has been focused on trying to expand the E-rate program. Some of this has been trying to get direct support to ensure that communities have access to things like telehealth and education resources and economic relief for folks who may be off the grid. You know, one of the things that I've been focused on is a bill that I sponsored called the Broadband for All Act that leverages the tax code. You know, again, these were things we were looking at before any of us had ever heard of coronavirus. I represent 11 Native American tribes. I was talking to one of the tribal leaders in the district I represent, and this was a couple years back, and I said, how's it going? And he said, you want the good news or the bad news? And I said, tell me the good news. He said, well, every one of our high school seniors graduated this year. And I said, that's awesome. I said, what's the bad news? He said, well, for the first time, the state's requiring our students take the state mandated exam on the internet. He said, Derek, we don't have high-speed internet. It's one of those questions, you know, tests where you answer 10 questions and click next page. He said, we timed it. It took 1 minute and 44 seconds to get to the next page. He said, so that's not going to work. So we're going to end up busing our kids to a school they've never been to, for some of our kids to a town they've never been to. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge that, you know, the federal response needs to step up to that reality. And I look at access to broadband almost like, you know, rural electrification was in decades back. And as we look at the response from the FCC, as we look at leveraging the tax code, and as we look at pulling every lever we can on that, it needs to be with a sense of urgency that your ability to function in a 21st century economy is going to really be stymied if you don't have access to the internet.
Okay, I'll give you a choice. Do you want to give some wrap-up comments, or do you want to take one more question?
Look, hold on. I can take one more.
Okay,
and
you
then
mentioned.
And then I'll transition my one more into wrap-up comments.
Perfect. You mentioned higher education and workforce development, and certainly with the amount of people being laid off and dislocated workers, and really just the change in the economy and new industries that are going to come up, those are going to be incredibly important. What is the federal government going to do to help support higher education, including community and technical colleges and workforce development programs?
Yeah, I mentioned, you know, part of the reason that we need to see the federal response include funding for states is to make sure that higher ed doesn't get clobbered. And that's one piece of this. I also mentioned the Skills Renewal Act, which is really designed to empower workers who have been laid off to be able to pursue retraining and to continue to buff up their skills. The other thing I'll say, though, is, again, these were issues before any of us had heard of coronavirus. You know, here's what we know. We know that not everybody's going to go to college, and not every job requires people to go to college. But we also know that as educational attainment goes up, so does the likelihood that someone is employed rather than unemployed. As educational attainment goes up, so do wages. And if you care about income inequality, and I do, then you should care about ensuring that more people can be educated to higher levels. As educational attainment goes up, you know, it reduces the likelihood that your job will be replaced by a computer or by a robot. In our state, if you're a high school dropout, you're 17% of our state's population. You're 55% of our state's prison population. You know, I'd much rather invest on the front end in giving people educational opportunity than on the back end in prisons and unemployment. And that also requires us, all of us, to be willing to have a more nuanced conversation around economic change in this country. You know, we have seen, unfortunately, in administration that if you are hurting in this economy right now, their predisposition is to blame immigrants, or to blame, in the words of the president, loser trade deals. And I actually think reality is far more complicated than that. And I think that scapegoating is completely unconstructive to actually solving some of the challenges that we face in our economy. You know, I think about it through the lens of where I've shopped in my lifetime. When I was a kid growing up in Port Angeles, we would go, my dad and I were hikers, and he'd always like to bring his camera. We'd go to Kit's Camera on First Street in Port Angeles. He'd buy a bunch of Kodak supplies. We'd go out and hike, and he'd take a bunch of pictures. You know, Kit's Camera doesn't exist anymore. Kodak, when I was a kid, employed 160,000 people in this country. It now employs 4% of that, in part because we all have cameras on our phones now, and we don't generally print our photos, we post them. You know, and that's not necessarily, those changes aren't necessarily bad, but they're bad if you worked at Kodak. And, you my first job was in something that no longer exists. I worked in a video store. I worked at West Side Video in Port Angeles. It pains me that the words "be kind, please rewind" mean nothing to my daughters, because they live in this amazing world of Netflix and YouTube and Amazon Prime, and they have unlimited content at their fingertips. So in many respects, that change isn't a bad thing, but it's bad if you were Rick, the guy who owned West Side Video. And so, in my view, part of how the federal government navigates these areas needs to be with the knowledge that part of the job needs to be empower workers to navigate economic change, not to be victimized by it. I've introduced a bill called the Skills Investment Act that creates something called lifelong learning accounts that would function almost like a 401k or an HSA, but around workforce training. It'd be optional and portable. The employer would pay into it, the employee would pay into it. Both would see some tax benefit for the contribution. But the worker could use it so that if the nature of their job was changing, they could go to night school. Or if they got laid off, they could go get retrained, in part because the world in which, my dad was a school teacher and had the exact same job for 50 years, those days are mostly over now. And so again, part of my focus is, how do we empower people to navigate that economic change, and workforce development and the role of our 2-year and 4-year colleges and universities is just central to that. And maybe that's a good place to end, and to acknowledge the fantastic role of your chamber and its members in advocating for smart workforce development strategies, for recognizing that our educational institutions are so central to that, that we can't, that it is not at cross purposes to be pro-business and pro-worker. To be pro-job means we have to be pro-worker. Your chamber has been a real leader in acknowledging that we can be pro-business and pro-environment, and the fact that your chamber has really leaned in on climate policy, I think, is really important, and I want to say thank you for that. And I also want to end where I began, which is, obviously we're in a really tumultuous time, not just in our economy, but in our country right now. And each of us has a role to play in that. On Saturday, I was at a prayer vigil a socially distant prayer vigil in Tacoma. And it was hard. It was hard because everybody was wearing masks, and, your ability to just see emotion on people's faces was hindered by that. And I'm someone who genetically wants to hug people when they're hurting, and we can't do that while we're social distancing. And but it was also hard because there's just a lot of pain and raw emotion right now, and justifiably so. And one of the pastors stood up and said, it is important for each one of us to recognize that each of us has a role to play in trying to ensure justice for Black Americans. Each of us has a role to play in trying to address some of the inequities, not just in our criminal justice system, but more broadly in our society. So I want to thank you and the Chamber and its members for working to be both listening and learning, but also standing in solidarity and taking action. We're going to really need that. So thank you.
Yeah, plenty of work ahead, and it will be hard and it will be uncomfortable, but we're looking forward to doing it in partnership with you. Thank you, Representative Kilmer, for joining us this morning, for your thoughtful answers to a wide range of questions, for your JAWS references. And also thank you to our series sponsor, our Business Health Trust, as well as our promotional partners, the Tacoma Pierce County Chamber and the Bellevue Chamber. We look forward, hopefully we can do this again with you sometime in the future. And then thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll talk to you tomorrow. We've got another webinar at 11 a.m. Part of this series, talking about the unemployment fraud, unemployment insurance fraud. So tune in tomorrow at 11 a.m. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.
Hi, everybody.